this is a passage that Christians have some debates about amongst themselves, right? We don't all have the same exact breakdown of some aspects of this, but okay, I'll give you the understanding that I'm familiar with, that I think is sound. But when you, okay, let me, wait, am I in Daniel 9? No, I'm in Daniel 7. Hold on. Let me get to the passage. All right, it says 70 weeks are decreed about your people. Let me skip down. It says in verse 26, after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. Okay, and then it says, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay, so there's after the cutting off of the anointed one, after the 62 weeks, which follows the 7 weeks, right? So 69 weeks into the 70 weeks that Daniel's talking about, it speaks of the cutting off of the anointed one. Then it speaks of the people of the prince who is to come, destroying the city and the sanctuary. Its end, that is the city and sanctuary, shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. Who is the he? Who's the antecedent there? Well, it's the prince who is to come. Okay, this is not the anointed one of verse 26 who's cut off. This is the prince of the people who are going to come and destroy the city and the sanctuary. You understand? In my understanding of this, this refers to the Roman invasion of Israel, the Jewish war with Rome in AD 70, and therefore the prince who is to come is a reference to to Titus, right? Who, under the orders of Vespasian, will resurrect after he's cut off and make that covenant. Yeah, see, there's some different approaches people can make, but at least it's clear here that after the cutting off of the anointed one, an army is going to come in and destroy the city and the sanctuary. So I think you already have them dead to rights right there. When was the temple destroyed? It was destroyed in AD 70. Who was the anointed one who was cut off? I mean, I have heard attempts to make it one or another of the high priests at the time. But the interesting thing is, like, if you look at the Talmud, it tells you 3 things in particular that were very strange in the first century for the 40 years prior to the temple's destruction, if I remember them correctly. The first is that the lot for the Lord never came up again in the right hand, right? Remember, they would cast lots, and one of the animals were to be sacrificed and the other was to be sent into the wilderness, right? Well, we're told that when you cast the lot, just in terms of statistics, 50% of the time it would come up in the right hand, 50% of the time it would come up in the left hand. But we're told that for the 40 years prior to the temple's destruction in AD 70, the lot never again came up in the right hand. They took this as a bad sign. Secondly, we're told that they couldn't keep the light going in the temple, right? They were required to perpetually keep the light going, and the light kept going out, right? And then thirdly, oh, you can't hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. And then the third thing is that there was a scarlet cord that would be in the temple when they went and made the sacrifice. The cord would turn white, signifying that the sacrifice had been accepted and the nation's sins had been atoned for. Right? They said that for the 40 years prior to the temple's destruction, it never again turned white. Now, if you go from AD 70 and you count back 40 years, where do you end up? You end up in AD 30. What happened in AD 30? Right? So basically what you have is this whole idea that the temple, I mean, God has rejected the temple and the priesthood and the sacrifices. He's no longer receiving them. Why? What did they do? In AD 30 that led to these, dismal state of affairs. And then finally consummating in their destruction, in the destruction of the temple. Well, obviously, I mean, you know my answer, and I don't think you can escape it, but it's the death of Christ. But so anyway, so the passage speaks of the sanctuary being destroyed, and since the temple was destroyed, we're limited to the first century. And when we look at the other events surrounding its destruction, such as the ones I brought out, and there's so many others, one of the things, Josephus talks about a comet over Jerusalem that resembled a sword before the destruction of the temple. And the people interpreted that as a bad sign, right? We're told by both Josephus and Tacitus that prior to the temple's destruction, all the people in Israel saw the clouds filling up, if you will, and I'd have to get the exact quote, but they saw heavenly beings surrounding the cities in the clouds and engaging in armed conflict in the heavens. Now, understand, I understand that naturalists and secularists would dismiss this sort of thing, but this is what we're given from the first century historians that we have to go on, right? They tell us that this is what happened, that there was an armed conflict in the heavens. We're told that the temple gates swung open inexplicably. Normally it took like 20 priests to open those gates. We're told they inexplicably opened, and a superhuman voice was heard to come from the temple saying, "Let us depart." Right? Let us depart. Who's talking there? Who's calling himself us? Anyways, but you have all these significant events surrounding the temple's destruction, and all of this. You go back to Daniel, and it says that all this is going to come to an end. I know I've ranged way beyond what you asked me, but I think that the prince who is to come, who's to destroy the city and the sanctuary, refers to Titus. But you could interpret it as a reference to Jesus, because remember that in the Old Testament, when God sends foreign nations against his people to punish them for their transgressions, he refers to those foreign leaders as his servants. He even refers to Cyrus as his anointed one, right? So God uses, God himself is pulling the strings of history, if you will. And when these destructions come to pass, God wasn't, asleep at the wheel of the universe. He was governing things and bringing. Dave Pawson mentions the decree ending at either the baptism or birth of Christ. Yeah, and I've heard other people say the decree ends when Jesus enters into Jerusalem, his triumphal entry. That's why I say there's some debates among Christians about the exact starting point and the exact end point of Daniel's prophecy. Some claim they can get within the last week of Christ's life, and that would take more time and a lot of detail to try and sort that out. But what I'm just trying to give you is enough to say there's no way around saying this refers to what happened in the first century. That's when the temple was destroyed. Daniel is prophesying in light of the rebuilding of the temple, the second temple, right? He's reflecting on the prophecy of Jeremiah and the expectation of the rebuilding of the temple. And so he's not thinking about some third temple that no Jew was even thinking about. All Jews were looking forward to a second temple being built, and that's the temple that was there when Christ came. That's the temple that was destroyed in the first century. That's the last temple that has been seen on planet Earth for 2,000 years. And so all the talk about a third temple is just desperate. In fact, Jews don't like it when we bring up the fact that some prophecies that are about the Messiah were fulfilled in his first coming, and other prophecies are going to be fulfilled in his second coming, even though I think we can find evidence for it in the Old Testament. And yet, notice what they're doing. In order to make these passages not be about Jesus, they have to talk about a third temple that they're not talking about, right? These passages are clearly talking about the second temple, and yet in order to safeguard or protect their anti-messianic theory, they have to come up with this concoction of a third temple. It simply isn't there. But one other thing real quickly, Bobo, if you look at Mark and Matthew's account of the Olivet Discourse, they talk about the abomination of desolation, or at least Matthew does. I can't recall the language that Mark uses. But Matthew speaks of the abomination of desolation. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, then he says, get out of Jerusalem, right? Jesus tells them to leave Jerusalem, right? Well, if you look at Luke's account, and I believe that Luke is writing primarily for a Gentile audience, so what Luke often does is he interprets these things to Jewish people who wouldn't understand them. If you look at Luke's account, he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then understand, right? And then he says to flee from Israel because her desolation is drawing nigh. So Luke interprets the coming desolation, or he associates it with Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. This is how Jerusalem's downfall is going to come about.